Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Gallant. I'm one of the co-chairs of the DSA International Committee's Subcommittee on Climate and Economics. Thank you all for coming to the inaugural session of our long-planned Intro to Global Economics Political Education series. As folks continue to trickle in over the next few minutes, I wanted to take a quick minute before the main event to speak to what this series is and what we hope to accomplish. 50 years ago, in his classic work, The Open Veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano wrote, quote, "The division of labor among nations is that some specialize in winning and others in losing." In the 5 decades since, I don't think anyone has said so much about the global economy in so few words. This series seeks to add a few more words onto that. How does the global economic system work? How do the rules of the capitalist neo-colonial system function to benefit the few at the expense of the many? What is the relationship between the exploitation of workers in the global north and the super exploitation of workers and peasants in the global south? And how do we transform this world for the protection of the planet and the liberation of the people in North and South alike? Over the coming months, the Intro to Global Economics series seeks to answer these questions and more, exploring the key dynamics of and actors in the contemporary global economic system. Of course, global economics is about as broad of a topic as possible. As socialists, we know that economy is inseparable from politics, from society, from culture, from anything. A complete picture of the global economy would ultimately be an entire history of the world, and at the least would require some careful readings on our part of Marx's Capital or Lenin's Imperialism. This series will not do that. We don't claim to be comprehensive intro to all of global political economy. Our aims are narrower, but not the less important for it. In the Northern left, much, if still insufficient, attention is paid to the more overt, attention-grabbing manifestations of imperialism, such as war and coups, and rightfully so. This series, though, seeks to introduce US socialists to the subtler, but no less insidious systemic functioning of global empire. Over the course of a few months, each session will cover a separate aspect of the economic system: debt, finance, the IMF, the rules of trade, dollar hegemony, intellectual property, and more, from the world that we have to the world that we want. This series rejects the pervasive and intentionally cultivated belief that these economic subjects are only for the, quote, experts. Whether the IMF's stranglehold on African economic independence, the shackles of debt that weigh down Latin America, or the WTO's war on workers from the US to the Philippines, these are issues that affect workers everywhere and are of critical importance to socialists of all stripes. This series aims to equip our movement with the foundational knowledge to confront them. That's it for me. We're thrilled that you all can join us for this session, and we hope that it's just one of many that you'll be able to attend. Before we begin, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all those who put dedicated hard work into this series, including Carrington Morris, Adam Ray, Chiro Faenza, Melanie Bressler, David Kotz, and many more. And now over to my brilliant co-chair, Melanie, who will be moderating this session and will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Michael. And yeah, thank you for everyone attending today. This is really exciting. So I also have a little bit of framing comments, and then we'll introduce the speakers. And our run of show will be introducing the speakers, and then people will go through with their sort of introductory comments, and then we will take audience questions. But given the number of people in attendance and the time that we have, I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to all of them, but please note that we will perhaps condense some or add groupings that seem to pair to each other. So please post your questions in the chat. So to begin, 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development released a pretty searing assessment of global economic prospects, in particular that of the Global South. Already at the start of this year, health and economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis remained anemic, fragile, and violently divergent between developed and developing countries. The US and other states at the apex of global monetary and economic dominance were limited in their crisis-fighting stimuluses and health responses only by their internal distributional politics. The Global South faced external constraints such as vaccine apartheid, unsustainable debt without recourse to restructuring or relief, vulnerability to capital flight, and other structural features that made their economic responses, paling in comparison. These already abhorrent conditions were worsening, or were already there but are now worsening in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the economic war waged in response. sanctions imposed on Russia through the weaponization of the dollar system and trade relations among dominant states now threatens global food stability, energy access, and growth upon which income is still dependent. As fossil fuel-driven inflation worsens in the wake of sanctions, the US Federal Reserve is engaging in global class war by raising interest rates, which will push workers in the global north and the global south into unemployment and induce capital flight, a surge in borrowing costs, and ultimately a sovereign debt crisis for developing countries due to the nature of the dollar system. Meanwhile, no state or bloc with the economic power to do so has initiated anything close to a macroeconomic stabilization program, let alone the climate and planetary system stabilization program necessary to meet the urgency of the climate crisis. UNCTAD, the author of this report, making some of these comments, was inaugurated by a formation of global South states in the height of decolonization to support their development against a world hostile to it. Its recent report is a testament to the persistence of this hostility, but also in its staunch advocacy of very clear alternatives to the fact that it's the violence inherent to capitalism and imperialism as social order organizing our planetary interdependence, and not that interdependence itself that's at the heart of this disorder. Our aim with this series, as Michael said, is to reveal the structural workings and political orderings of the global capitalist system so that we can organize to both radically restructure systemic nodes of this system and ultimately transcend it as we build towards global democratic eco-socialism. This first session seeks to introduce us DSA organizers to the global economy, its main actors, dynamics, and functions, and specifically how this came to be. Our speakers will lead us through the inherently intertwined origins of capitalism and imperialism and how these systems drive racism, climate change, and exploitation, and then through struggles for decolonization and equitable development by the global South, and through the way the neoliberal world reordering in response to these movements from below shape our system today. Our speakers are Dr. Adom Getachew, who is Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago, and the author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. Also Dr. Jason Hickel, who is an economic anthropologist, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and the author of, among other things, The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions. And then by Dr. David Kotz, who is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, the author of The Rise and Fall of Neoliberal Capitalism, and a member of the DSA International Committee and the National Political Education Committee. Now over to Dr. Adom Getachew for her introductory comments.
Great. Well, first, just thanks to Michael and Melanie, for those introductions and for the invitation to be in conversation with all of you today. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's, as Melanie put it very clearly in her opening remarks, the stakes of this conversation could not be higher given the kind of crises and consequences of the pandemic over the last 2 years and the economic and political fallouts of the pandemic. My job on this panel is to give a brief, kind of snapshot, I guess, of both the colonial origins of the global economy and the specific kind of struggles and contestations during the period of decolonization from about the 1940s to about the 1970s. I will basically tell the story very briefly from the perspective of the Caribbean and Africa, which are the places from which I work and think. The kinds of questions I want to take up here very briefly are: how did colonialism underdevelop the global South? How might we understand the period of decolonization as a kind of moment of contesting international economic inequality, as well as a kind of political, as well as a struggle for political independence? And third, how did decolonization and those struggles and contestations of that 30 to 35 year period continue to shape the global economy that we inhabit? So to think about that first question about how colonialism underdeveloped the global South, I think the Caribbean is a particularly useful place to think about this connection. In many ways, 1492, the quote unquote discovery of the Americas and the space of the Caribbean is really, we might say, the birth of the modern world and the birth of a modern economy. And this is a place intimately tied, of course, to three convergences: the genocide of Native people, the process of the history of transatlantic slavery and the slave trade, and the plantation as a model of kind of economic production, but also a political governance. So thinking about those three kind of that nexus, the Caribbean is sitting at the nexus of those three formations, I think there's a few things we might say about how underdevelopment happens. One is that the Caribbean, as other sites of as is the case with other sites of the global South, is organized as a kind of site of extroversion, right? Its production is geared towards a global market. It produces commodities, primary goods for an external market rather than for an internal market. This also means that there's a specific form of dependence that this relationship produces. So while exporting primary goods, sugar in particular, but other extracted resources, there's other things that are needed for the domestic economy, especially food, would actually be imported into the region. So there's this kind of both a kind of, one is constantly dependent on a precarious global market, right? And the fluctuations of prices for commodities really shape the country. At the same time, there's this kind of another dependence, which is that basic necessities ought to be imported into the country. The third thing I might say about this is that these are kind of, Michael used the language of super exploitation. The plantation labor we might think of as this form of super exploitation and political domination, that structured plantation labor, both during the period of slavery and then kind of in its afterlives. And there's a few kind of, I think, very important chroniclers of this process who make the case very explicitly that these processes of production and hyper-exploitation in the colony in the Caribbean come to shape the modern economy. So just to name a few texts, one is C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins of 1938. Another is Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery of 1944. In different ways, both of these books make the case that the innovations in production, the high productivity of plantations, generate the conditions for industrialization within Britain and within Europe more generally. So there's this kind of way in which kind of extraction and exploitation come to create the conditions of economic growth and innovation within the global North. Walter Rodney, who was mentored in part by C.L.R. James, would expand this thesis, initially articulated among Caribbean scholars to think about the Caribbean and to think about the plantation economy to the wider, to the African context. And his book from the 70s, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is a kind of crucial touchstone in a kind of world systems and dependency schools of thinking. And he would also, in other work of this period, trace the ways in which the plantation as an institution actually traveled to sites around colonial Africa, and in particular to Tanzania, reproducing the forms of coercion and violence associated with the plantation, even in a context where formal chattel slavery did not exist. So those are some texts that help us really think through this kind of relationship between underdevelopment and development. And I think the main takeaway for us from this scholarship is that the global economy, or something that we now know as globalization, is not a product of the last 50 years or the last 70 years, but it's a process that actually begins in the 15th century. And to understand it as beginning in that period is to understand the ways in which the production of a global economy is created by and through imperial expansion and imperial exploitation. So there is a kind of, as Melanie was saying, a kind of interdependence created, right? All of these parts of the world are for the first time integrated with each other, but that integration takes on a very deeply divided and uneven structure, right? So we might think of this process as one of unequal integration. So given that that's, one way to think about the kind of relationship between imperialism and the global economy, I think we should understand decolonization not just as one of securing political independence, but really one of contesting this hierarchical world order. We tend to think of decolonization as a political event, but as the historian Vanessa Ogle has recently argued, it was also an economic and financial event and process. So when, as decolonization begins to appear on the horizon in the post-World War II period, starting with, most importantly with India in 1947, Ghana in 1957, and then a whole slew of independences in the 60s in Africa and in the West Indies. Decolonizing states appear on the international stage and face regimes of political and economic governance, from the United Nations to the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which were created, of course, without their input, right? So these institutions of post-war governance were created in the 40s and 50s when none of these states were on, or had a seat at the tables, so to say. And so they were institutions organized and structured implicitly with at least with the sense that imperial rule would persist, and very explicitly around the kind of interests, aims, and orientations of the kind of core countries of the global economy. So in this period, new states seek to use their independence and their newfound political sovereignty to challenge the structures of political and economic inequality within the world order. And I want to give just two examples of these, of the kinds of challenges or the kinds of innovations they introduce. First is the idea of trying to create regional federations. Eric Williams, who was Prime Minister of Trinidad, was a major advocate of these forms of regional integration. So was Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first Prime Minister and then President of Ghana. What the kind of vision of federation was meant to do it was try to use a kind of political infrastructure to respond to these economic challenges. What I mean by that is, if Trinidad is kind of economically dependent on a kind of global market, Williams hoped that by federating with other West Indian countries, creating a West Indies federation, gradually they could create a kind of regional economy and produce for that regional economy rather than kind of constantly producing for an external market. So in many ways, we can think of this federal imagination not as a kind of entirely autarkic system, but or what Samir Amin would later call delinking, right? Removing yourself from the global economy, but in an attempt to restructure one's relationship to the global economy by kind of expanding what counts as your domestic economic space, right? And by creating larger regional markets and having the capacity to imagine a developmental model for the region rather than for small states, one could exercise a different kind of bargaining power on the global stage, right? So an attempt to rethink and restructure that relationship of dependence. Now, this was a very short-lived project, and I'm happy to say more about its failure. But I think a second model for us to think with is the new international economic order of the 1970s. Now, this particular vision really takes at face value that we inhabit though the world is one economic unit, but that it is a divided economic unit, and that it analogizes the positions of the poorer nations or the states of the global south to the status of the workers of the world. And it begins to think about a set of redistributive mechanisms that are primarily tied to trade relationships. So this is a period in which prices for the commodity goods that post-colonial states produce, like coffee and cocoa and bauxite, are declining. So they try, for instance, to create associations, producer associations that are supposed to function like trade unions and negotiate the prices of these commodities. They create other kinds of mechanisms that are meant to shore up the trading positions of post-colonial states. So by the end of the 1970s, a kind of the beginnings of the trade crisis really shift the position, the bargaining position of the third world, and whatever room there was to even contest and debate the kind of structures of the new international economic order, they would be quickly kind of undermined in this period of the debt crisis. It's really important to me, I think, that the debt crisis starts in Jamaica in the late 1970s. So we're back to the Caribbean and thinking about the space of the Caribbean as really a kind of central space which originates like new kind of regimes of the global economy, let's just say. I think this transition also marks, for me, a central limitation of the thinking that structured the 1960s and 70s moment of decolonization, which is that much of the emphasis of that period was on international trade, right? On kind of transforming trade relationships between global North and South. And while trade is really important, the 1970s really demonstrates the importance of monetary and financial politics. So in the early 80s, there are attempts, third world attempts, to kind of transform international monetary policy, to challenge US dollar dominance, to create a kind of international reserve currency. But the weakened bargaining power of the third world in the wake of this kind of the debt crisis means that there's little progress and little room for maneuver or for thinking about these possibilities. So that's in some ways where the kind of period of decolonization leaves us off. So the final part I would like to talk about, and I'll do this briefly, is just that the ways that that moment of struggle and contestation over the shape of the economic order and the failures of these attempts to rethink and reimagine that order continue to shape the global economy in a myriad of ways. So I just want to give a few, I think, really interesting examples. One is, I mentioned the historian Vanessa Ogle already, but she has a really incredible essay that came out last year about how actually this period of decolonization sees the expansion of tax havens, which is something that we've now become very familiar with the leaks of the Panama Papers and others. This was because European settlers who were in the colonies, businessmen, and others were liquidating assets that they had in the global south for fear of expropriation. And rather than kind of them ending back in metropolitan states where they would be subject to high taxes, they ended up in tax havens. So this kind of practice of offshoring that's become so prominent in contemporary debates actually is deeply tied to this history of decolonization and would be one of the ways in which the extraction of resources and wealth from the developing world would be kind of institutionalized or further entrenched in this period. The second is, of course, that we inhabit a world of kind of nominal independence for the global south or the former third world, but continue to have, but that nominal political independence has not, it's been incredibly difficult to translate that meaningfully to charting developmental paths and trajectories that are adequate to the task of transforming post-colonial economies. So sometimes there are very explicit structures and institutions that produce these constraints. The Senegalese economist Ndongo Sambasila has written, for instance, about the Safa currency. This is a currency, colonial era currency, used by 7 Francophone African countries, and that was pegged to the franc initially and now to the euro. And through this kind of pegging, France has kind of veto power on all monetary policy in these countries. They have, French officials sit, for instance, on central bank boards in Senegal and other places. But even when there's not these very direct neo-colonial links between former colonial powers and post-colonial states, the need for financing and market access means that third world states, even when they're trying to innovate new economic models, new developmental visions, are deeply constrained by that dependence or need for financial access, financing and market access. And there's also a great deal of pressure to model their kind of economic governance institutions domestically on models developed primarily in the United States. So I'll recommend here a really excellent podcast interview with Ndongo Sambasila and Daniela Gabor on the Dig, which from February, called Financial Empire, which was really excellent. So I want to also I'll just end by saying that experience of nominal political independence and economic dependence or domination, I think really no longer just characterizes the global south, right? But it's actually an experience that has over the last 50 years become the experience of states more broadly, right? So the idea that there is a kind of national economy, which was the sort of basis, say, of the welfare states of Western Europe or the New Deal of the United States, that was never a reality for the third world, but it's also increasingly no longer a reality for the kind of nominally core countries of the economy. So I think this is just a reason to think, this is for those of us who are in the United States and leftists in the global north, it's an opportunity to think about how having a kind of vision of the international global economy, the global economy is not only it's not only about solving kind of questions of inequality between global north and south, or kind of addressing the various economic crises of the global South, but it's also central to resolving the kind of crises within our own societies. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions.
Great, thank you so much. And now over to Jason.
All right, thanks very much. Just give me a second to share my screen, if I may. Hang on. Okay, so I only have 15 minutes to run through the bit of history that I was assigned. In fact, a lot of things that I was hoping to talk about have been covered brilliantly and eloquently by Adom already. So that's excellent. Makes my job a little bit easier. I'm going to use slides just because I want to cover quite a lot of territory in a short period of time. So I want my main points to be clear here. And also because there's a few pictures that I want to show you. But first, let me just kind of briefly let you know what I'm going to do here. I'm going to try to situate the history of the neoliberal turn of the 1980s or 1970s, 1980s within the context of the broader history of capitalism and its particular structural imperatives. Second, I'm going to explain how neoliberalism should be understood as a response to the anti-colonial movement that Adom described. And I'll argue that the imposition of neoliberal policy was intended to restore the imperial arrangement on which capitalism fundamentally depends. And then finally, I'm going to explain what I think is wrong with the very common assumption prominent among some Western progressives that neoliberalism was just a mistake and that all we need to do is go back to the more humane version of capitalism that prevailed during the post-war decades. So I'll argue that the only actual solution to this is in fact to transition to a post-capitalist economy. Okay, so, but first I want to start by establishing a key theoretical point here, which is that capitalist growth requires by its nature an imperial arrangement, okay? The key thing to understand here is that under capitalism, increasing production, which we refer to as growth, is not actually primarily about meeting human needs. It's about extracting and accumulating surplus value, right? Or an easy way to understand this maybe is profit. Now, to sustain this process of perpetual expansion and surplus accumulation, capital needs two crucial things. First, an ever-rising quantity of labor and resources, okay? This is a necessity for a perpetually expanding system. And second, these inputs, right, labor and resources, must be obtained for as cheaply as possible, and ideally for free, right? So what's apparent here is that a capitalist economy is not just any economy. It's not just markets and trade. It's specifically an economy predicated on perpetual expansion for the sake of surplus accumulation. We have to understand what distinguishes capitalism from other market and trade systems that prevailed for the tens of thousands of years prior to the rise of capitalism 500 years ago, right? Now, crucially, this kind of system cannot be sustained within a kind of isolated context, right? If you're going to extract ever-rising quantities of labor and resources and cheapen them perpetually as much as possible, this is bound to lead to some kind of contradiction. You're going to degrade your domestic resource base, leading to ecological instability, and you're going the exploitation of your domestic labor base will eventually lead to some kind of unrest, right? So if you want to avoid the likelihood of some kind of revolution or some kind of ecological disaster, then what you require to sustain accumulation is some kind of third party that can be exploited and extracted from with impunity, and where resistance can be contained with violence if necessary, right? So some third party that's not in a position to fight back, right? And this is where the colonies come in. For the entirety of its 500-year history, capitalism has required an imperial arrangement, right? So this is why there's no gap between the rise of capitalism in the 15th century and the rise of European colonization. They emerge as part of the same project because it is required for the stabilization of a capitalist economy, right? So it's important to understand the intrinsic imperial dimensions of capitalist economics. Now, all of this becomes disrupted during the middle of the 20th century with the anti-colonial struggle that was defined earlier, right? So during this period, we have progressive and radical anti-colonial movements from across the global South succeeding in throwing off direct colonization, as well as other forms of imperial power, such as in Latin America against US meddling. And what they did is they began pursuing the principles of economic sovereignty. Okay, and this really gained steam in the 1950s with the Bandung Conference, which is sort of the touchstone of the cooperative anti-colonial movements among nation states. And here we see some of the key leaders of that moment in 1955 itself. So this leads to what I refer to as the rise of the South. This is an incredible period in global economic history that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in the way we normally think about this period. So progressive governments that are newly independent are rolling out what we refer to as developmentalist reforms. Now, this is a broad catch-all term for what's going on here. Some of these states were socialists, others were anti-imperialist, but not necessarily socialist, but focused nonetheless on kind of national independence. Okay, some of the key principles and policies were land reform. Okay, so they're shifting land away from colonial control back into the hands of those who were dispossessed during the colonial period. And they're also supporting, of course, small farmers. They're improving workers' wages by legalizing unionization for the first time. Unions were illegal under colonialism. They were investing in public services like healthcare and education, again, for the first time on a mass scale, considering these to be basic rights. And they were nationalizing key resources like oil, but also other key resources that the global economy depended on, which the global South effectively controls, right? They were protecting their domestic industries with trade tariffs and with subsidies to build their own sovereign industrial capacity, throwing off the arrangement whereby they were merely exporters of cheap raw materials and importers of Western manufactured goods. So this is a significant disruption of the colonial world economy. And it was extremely successful across the global South. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, per capita income in the global South on average grew at about 3.2% per year. They made extraordinary gains against poverty towards meeting basic needs at a decent standard for the time. And this rate of growth is in excess of what the global North achieved during its own industrial revolution. So it's quite extraordinary. Not only were they doing this domestically, but they were also cooperating together in the form of the non-aligned movement founded in the 1960s, led by some of these core socialist and anti-imperialist leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nehru of India, and Nasser of Egypt, some of the key figures here, but there were several more. Okay, they were arguing, in effect, for a fair global economy with real democracy at the UN, which they achieved in the form of the General Assembly. And this is an extraordinary transformation in global politics, where you effectively have the majority of humanity represented by global South nation states with democratic control in a major political body, the General Assembly. But almost immediately, there was a backlash against the rise of the South because it basically, the rise of economic sovereignty in the South basically threatens the possibility of Northern growth and capital accumulation, right? This was very clear to Northern capitalist leaders. The developmentalist policies were constraining Northern access to cheap Southern labor and resources, as well as to Southern markets, which they had depended on during the colonial period to absorb their excess industrial output, and of course, for cheap inputs, okay? What this did effectively was increase the supply price on which Northern capitalism relied, which had negative effects on the possibility of capital accumulation and profit making, as well as on growth itself, as we'll see shortly. So Northern states, recognizing this threat to the stability of capitalism in the core, intervenes directly in global South countries. And this is what I refer to as the age of the coup. And I'm just going to briefly describe some of these interventions because I think they're very important to remember. And these faces should be familiar to us, I hope, because they're truly significant figures of the 20th century that I think are too often, again, forgotten in our usual historiography. So this is Mohammad Mosaddegh, progressive president of Iran. He was deposed in 1953 by a UK and US coalition-backed coup, primarily because he threatens Western access to Western control over Iranian oil reserves. He was replaced with a right-wing dictator who governs the Iranian economy for several decades in a way that was more in line with Western interests. The same story is repeated over and over again. And so I won't go into details, but this is Jacobo Arbenz, the second democratically elected president of Guatemala. For his land reform policies, he was deposed in 1954 by a US-backed coup because his land reform threatens US corporate control over Guatemalan territory, which he was shifting back to Guatemalan peasants. This is Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected president of the Congo, extraordinarily popular figure across the African continent, really like an icon of the anti-colonial movements. He sort of held the hopes of the continent in his hands during this period. He was deposed in 1961 by a US, UK, and Belgian coalition-backed coup in what was also a brutal assassination, replaced with a cartoonishly corrupt right-wing dictator directly backed by the US and allied states. This is João Goulart, president of Brazil, who was deposed in 1964 by a US-backed coup and replaced by a military junta. And this, of course, is Kwame Nkrumah, first independent president of Ghana, deposed in 1966 by a UK and US-backed coup. By the way, only a few months after he published his iconic text, Neo-Colonialism. This is Sukarno, the progressive leader of Indonesia after independence, deposed in 1967 by a US-backed coup, again replaced by a corrupt, violent military dictator that governed in Indonesia in US interests. And this, of course, is the one that we all know, Salvador Allende, deposed in 1973 by US-backed coup, replaced with Pinochet. Again, this story repeats itself over and over during this devastating period. And Global South leaders are watching as one another are being toppled in this manner for taking simple steps toward economic sovereignty, right? These very simple policies were considered a profound threat to core economies. And yet, despite these interventions, the South was still rising. As was mentioned earlier, they were forming associations like OPEC, but also around other resources, demanding fairer prices for natural resource exports. The non-aligned movement formed the G77 to cooperate in the halls of the UN, and they passed, again, as was mentioned earlier, the New International Economic Order, extraordinary documents in 1973 that calls for global economic justice and enshrines the principle of national economic sovereignty. But all of this effectively leads to what we can describe as the collapse of the colonial arrangements during the 1970s. And this triggers a crisis of stagflation in the global north, right? So inflation plus slowing growth due to the rising supply price from the global south. So we see a direct causal relationship here. And global north states basically face a choice. Do we abandon capital accumulation and try to shift towards a post-capitalist, more needs-based economy? Or do we try to retain the mechanisms of accumulation by reimposing the imperial arrangement somehow? And they go hardcore for the latter option. And they get their solution primarily in the form of the Volcker Shock in 1980, where the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, jacks up interest rates in the US to double digits, 20%. During this period, the goal of which is to clamp down on domestic inflation, but the strong effect of which is basically to push much of the global south into the third world, what was called at the time the third world debt crisis. Basically debts that were denominated in US dollars and which had initially had very low interest rates and which were quite repayable, suddenly had very high interest rates, were not repayable, and states exercised their right to choose to default on those debts. Of course, this threatened Western banks that were overexposed to third world debts. And they went to the US governments demanding effectively to be protected from this. The US government complied, and they used the World Bank and the IMF to impose, and this is the key mechanism, to impose structural adjustment programs across the global south during the 1980s and 1990s, okay? Now, what structural adjustment programs did is they effectively, in one fell swoop, reversed the progressive reforms of the immediate post-colonial era. So they required global south states to privatize state companies and state assets, and with the returns from this fire sale to repay their debt. So effectively, the value of assets in the global south was being transferred effectively to northern banks, again, overexposed to this debt crisis. They also demanded cuts to social spending, so that healthcare and education programs that were being rolled out were slashed. The social wage was effectively decimated. And again, the savings, the so-called savings from the cuts to social spending, again, were sent towards debt repayments. So again, resources were taken literally from the mouths of the poorest people on the planet and sent to prop up failing Western banks. And then finally, they imposed a regime of trade liberalization, removing the tariffs and subsidies and capital controls that global South states had brought in during the progressive era, and cutting protections on labor and the environment to depress the prices of labor and resources once again, right? So I've referred to this as a bloodless coup because it effectively accomplished what the earlier coup mongering did, but in a much more effective way, covering several states at once and without the kind of negative PR publicity that accompanied direct military interventions. They were not really bloodless, however, because they entailed an extraordinary amount of suffering and damage, which is impossible to cover here, but I can do it very briefly just by looking at what happens to economic output during this period. This is Latin America, with GDP per capita rising up until 1980, and then effectively entering a 2-decade-long period of decline and stagnation, right? Poverty rises, wages collapse, hunger increases, et cetera, et cetera. It's an extraordinary de-development of the continent. The same thing happens in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, a 2-decade-long period of decline. Per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa has only recently recovered its pre-structural adjustment levels, if you can believe it. This is quite extraordinary. Again, what this represents is effectively the impoverishments of the region. So one might ask how the World Bank and the IMF got away with such destructive policies once the destructive effects were becoming apparent. And the reason is because these, again, as was mentioned earlier, these were founded as colonial institutions. They're deeply anti-democratic. Just to give you a sense for the scale of this, the US holds veto power in both institutions over all major decisions, okay? So these are effectively tools of US international economic power. The G7 itself, as a unit, commands a majority of the voting power in these institutions, even today. What that means is that the global South, which has the majority of the world's population, something like 85%, has a minority share of voting power in these institutions. Even if they all banded together to overturn some major policy, they would not have the power to do so. So this is effectively, I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. This is effectively an apartheid system of governance that operates at the very core of the world international system. If it operated in any national parliament, we would, of course, be outraged by the obvious racial inequalities entailed therein. And yet we effectively don't bat an eyelid when it comes to this operating at the core of our own international governance institutions, despite long-standing demands from the global South that they be democratized or closed. Now, one question that often arises is why didn't the South just default on these debts and avoid the imposition of structural adjustment altogether? Why couldn't they just get out from under that relationship? Again, they had the right to do so. Well, the answer is that this was tried most distinctively by this man, Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s. He recognized that debt was being used as a tool for structural adjustment and the reimposition of imperial power across the continent. And he stood up in the halls of the African Union and called openly for collective debt resistance and collective debt default, saying explicitly, if we default on our debts, nobody dies, no one gets hurt. But if we pay our debts, then we die. This stimulated a kind of a fervor around the possibility of collective debt resistance. And only a few months after this, he was assassinated in a French-backed coup and replaced with a dictator who was only recently deposed. So this operated as kind of a cautionary tale, if you will, for the rest of the global South to avoid this route. So in the end, effectively, and I realize I'm short on time here. In the end, effectively, what's going on is that structural adjustment rescues Northern capitalism and growth. It restores the imperial arrangements by dismantling Southern competition, recreating captive markets, opening new frontiers for Northern capital, restoring the profitability of Northern corporations. All of this is documented in the empirical literature, and has the ultimate effect of depressing the prices of Southern labor and resources, which is crucial. What this does is because in international trade, all imports have to be paid for with exports. What a price inequality in international trade means that for every unit of labor and resources embodied in imports from the north, you have to export many more back to the north to pay for it. And this sustains a large net transfer of resources and embodied labor from the south to the global north to this day. And we refer to this as net appropriation through unequal exchange. Very briefly, we recently documented the scale of this in empirical terms in this paper, and we found a net flow from south to north of 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials. That's twice the total resource output of Africa, of the continent of Africa per year. 21 exajoules of embodied energy, which would be enough, by the way, to end energy poverty across the south and develop infrastructure sufficient to meet human needs at a high standard and close the health gap. 820 million hectares of embodied land, which is twice the size of India, sufficient to provide nutritious food to up to 6 billion people, and 188 million person years of embodied labor. So that's a standing army of 188 million people working all year long for production, for consumption in the global north, without any compensation in kind, right? So this is a net transfer. These resources and this labor could be used to meet domestic human needs, but instead are organized around servicing Northern capital accumulation and growthism. And this is what effectively produces the rising inequality in the world system that we see. This is GDP per capita in constant terms since the end of the colonial period. What becomes clear is that rising global inequality is an effect of the imperialist structure of the world economy. It's not because global South states are somehow behind on the ladder of development. It's because they are actively exploited for the sake of accumulation in the global north, okay? So my concluding remark is simply this, to say that neoliberalism was not a mistake. And this is contra to people like Paul Krugman, who insist that the only problem with the world today is neoliberalism. You can just go back to Keynesianism of the post-war era. I don't see this as being possible. We have to recognize that neoliberalism was imposed precisely in order to sustain the possibility of continued capitalist accumulation. The choice was between shifting to a post-capitalist economy or taking the neoliberal path. The latter was taken. And I think what becomes clear for us is that we face the same choice today. And if we as progressives want to sustain the possibility of social justice at home, right, with rising wages and a welfare state at home, and also support anti-imperialist struggles abroad, this cannot be sustained within the context of a capitalist economy. It requires a shift to a post-capitalist economy, abandoning the pursuit of surplus accumulation in favor of a needs-based order. So I'll close there, and I'll leave it to the next panelist to continue.
Great, thank you so much. And now we have David.
Well, the previous two speakers covered a lot of the key points about the global economy today. My role in this session is to provide some additional context and overview about the current global economy, imperialism, its costs, and ways to protest against it. Mainstream economics teaches that the globalized economy of today benefits everyone. Free trade, it is claimed, benefits consumers while reorganizing each country's economy to produce those goods that is most effective at producing, benefiting all countries. Absence of barriers to foreign investments is supposed to enable low-income countries to accelerate their economic advance. Opening to foreign banks is supposed to enable better access to capital. The IMF, we are told, stands ready to make dollar loans to governments that are short of dollars that they need for imports. The World Bank is supposed to offer development loans that will assist low-income countries to develop. The conditions that are imposed on loans by these international institutions is intended, it is said, to prevent governments from short-sighted decisions that would undermine economic growth, such as spending too much on the public sector. Enforcement of intellectual property rights is lauded as a way to stimulate technological advance that benefits everyone. As you all know, the real picture is quite different. The global economy today is designed to serve the interests of US imperialism. By imperialism, I mean the economic and political domination of one country or region by the ruling class of another. Imperialist domination historically has involved formal political rule, usually called colonialism, but also many cases, many periods of informal domination. British India, a case of formal political rule versus US control of Cuba from 1899 to 1959 without formal political control. Imperialism predates capitalism. Ancient Rome had a slave economy and built a great empire, as Lenin noted. However, the capitalist era has seen the rise of the greatest empires in history. Imperialism imposes huge costs on people in dominated countries and also costs on the working class in the imperial power. So I will comment on the roots of imperialism that structures the global economy today, the harmful effects of the imperialist global economy, including fomenting racism and worsening climate change, and some brief comments about how socialists can oppose imperialism. The roots of modern imperialism, as previous speakers noted, are found in the capitalist system. Capitalism is based on exploitation of labor. Capitalists get profit by taking part of what workers produce. Capitalism gives rise to a powerful accumulation drive, which means reinvesting part of the profit to produce on a larger scale and get more profit. That accumulation drive leads capitalists to break the bonds of their nation state, to export goods and services, to build production facilities abroad, to lend money abroad, and to obtain raw materials and production inputs abroad. Why is this different from geographic expansion within a country? The key point here is that capitalism is not just an economic system. It requires a state to enforce and protect capitalist pursuit of profit. The capitalists must control the state if capitalism is to be viable. But when capitalists expand beyond their home state, they face the problem of foreign states that might not prioritize the interests of foreign capital. The implication is that when capitalists from a powerful state engage in activities outside the home country, they bring their state with them to protect their pursuit of profit. In my view, that is the underlying driving force of imperialist domination in the capitalist era. In some periods, a single capitalist state has been the dominant imperial power, known as the hegemon, where hegemonic means simply domination. Britain was the hegemonic power in the capitalist world in the 19th century, and that's the only world there was then. The USA has been the hegemon, the global hegemon since 1945, replacing Britain. The imperial hegemon structures the global capitalist system with the aim of protecting the interests of its capitalist class while also maintaining a coalition with the other big capitalist powers, whose assistance is needed to maintain the domination of the major imperial powers as a group. After World War II, as previous speakers noted, the US, with its main assistant, the UK, constructed a new form of the global capitalist economy. There was established the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a new international monetary and financial system known as the Bretton Woods system. The form of that system in the immediate post-war decades was influenced by the existing of a new state socialist bloc that unified the major capitalist states and tended to play down the conflicts and competition among them. That lasted through the 1970s. That form of the global imperial system was only partly open. It allowed tariffs, it allowed some barriers to foreign investments. It permitted a social democratic version of capitalism in the global north, although it didn't tolerate it in the global south, as was noted in previous comments. Around 1980, capitalism around the world was transformed through neoliberal restructuring. And Jason recounted the global aspects of that transformation. That gave rise to the neoliberal form of the global economy today. The roles of the IMF and the World Bank changed at that time, as Jason noted, enforcing structural adjustment programs. New institutions arose as well, such as the World Trade Organization. Neoliberalism was characterized by an intensified globalization of capitalism, by a demand that the state give more sway to private business and to market forces in the economy, an end to the capital labor compromise that had prevailed in the global north, and the freeing of financial institutions to engage in speculative activity. In addition to the devastating attack on the global south that was initiated at the end of the 1970s by Paul Volcker and others, there was also a devastating attack on the working class in the north. Now, the effects of the global imperialist system over time, over the whole period. In earlier periods of imperialism, the global system led to enslavement of peoples whose labor was needed in the form of slave labor in the global north, to extermination of peoples whose labor was not needed, but who occupied land that was desired by the capitalists. In the current stage of the global imperialist system, imperialism leads to, as has been noted, super exploitation of workers in the global south and oppression of other groups through foreign investment, through subcontracting arrangements, taking advantage of low wages, dangerous working conditions, weak environmental regulations, and tax breaks. The global north imperial powers, their companies can get advantages, and they can't do that as companies. Those conditions are not just naturally present. The US state and the other major imperial powers enforce the conditions that will make activities in the global south as profitable as possible. They get extra profit, known as super profit. They also gain control of raw materials and obtain a major share of the revenue from them. And the relationship in certain periods blocks development in the global south by locking countries into stagnant primary product exports. Although there have been some exceptions of conditions that permitted a global south country to escape, but they're a small minority. In the global north, at the same time, this global system puts the working class in the global north in competition with workers in the global south, undermines their bargaining power, drives down wages, worsens working conditions, undermines the trade union movement. Some parts of the working class get material benefits, particularly in export sectors. Some claim that the cheaper goods that flow from the global south benefit working people in the north. However, what we've seen in the neoliberal era is that while consumer goods did become cheaper, partly because of an inflow of final goods and components from the global south, at the same time, the greatly increased bargaining power of capital relative to labor in the global north meant that wages fell along with the prices of those consumer goods that workers consume. In the US, in the neoliberal era, since around 1980, the real wage, the buying power of the average wage has trended downward. Essentially, the benefit of cheaper consumer goods was seized by the capitalist class. It didn't help the working class in the global north. Then there are costs of imperialism in the whole world. Imperialism gives rise to war of several kinds. Wars of imperial conquest, such as the US war in Iraq, the NATO actions in Libya, throwing out the existing Gaddafi government. Then there are wars of national liberation, waged by Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and even around in the US in 1776. It had an aspect of an early war of national liberation. Those wars are justified, but they still impose big costs when oppressed peoples are forced to fight them. And then finally, there are wars of inter-imperial rivalry, which have the biggest costs of destruction. World War I, World War II, wars in which the dominant imperial powers fight amongst themselves over their shares of the spoils. In my view, as I'll mention at the end, I think the current Ukraine war has an element of war of inter-imperial rivalry. And in all wars, it is working class people who fight and die in both the global north and the global south. I think a case can be made that the effect of capitalism in bringing war and imperialism have probably produced more socialists and communists than any other negative outcome of capitalism over the decades. Imperialism foments racism, another important effect. The early period of capitalism gave rise to anti-African racist ideas in Europe and North America. When capitalism began importing African slaves to labor in the Americas, a justification was needed for enslavement of people in an era, in the capitalist era, that claimed to believe in the rights and dignity of all individuals. And so the inferiority of Africans served as a justification and facilitated the effective exploitation of Africans. The imperialist powers often have picked a minority group in a dominated country to serve as an agent of rule, thereby leaving hostilities among ethnic and religious groups when colonialism was lifted, such as in formerly British India. Imperialism also worsens climate change, a deadly threat to human civilization. The fundamental driver of climate change is capitalism itself and its profit drive. That profit drive pushes toward ignoring environmental costs. Capitalism empowers enterprises that profit from carbon emission. Imperialism also drives climate change and makes it harder to stop. Imperialism leads to frequent preparation for war and war itself, which involves huge carbon emissions. We've been noticing, couldn't miss it, that the current accelerating war atmosphere today is pushing climate change action off the political stage. Imperialism creates a world of rivals, which makes it difficult to get the global cooperation that is needed to stop global climate change. How can we oppose imperialism? DSA is a socialist organization located in the imperialist hegemon. We have an obligation to oppose and resist US imperialism, to act in solidarity with victims of US imperialism. But this is not a matter of supporting people in the third world at the expense of our constituency in the US. At the same time, we should point out that imperialism also harms the working class in the global north. And on that basis, we can strive for solidarity between the working class in the global north and the global south. Note that imperialist domination and war do not always involve a north-south axis, as in the current case of the Ukraine war. Socialists need a position on it that takes account of all aspects. And in my view, this is controversial. One aspect of the current war in Ukraine is an inter-imperial rivalry between the US state and NATO on the one hand, and the capitalist Russian state. With an understanding of the imperialist global system, we should be able to take account of all the aspects of developments such as the Ukraine war in our political work. Can imperialism be eliminated from the world? It cannot be eliminated as long as capitalism dominates the world. In a future democratic socialist world, there should be no drive to exercise imperialist domination. Imperialist domination serves the interest of a tiny minority ruling class. Exercising imperialist domination does not make sense for the majority. The costs of domination in the end are greater than any economic advantage obtained. Only when a tiny ruling class gets the benefits while others bear the cost is there a logic to imperialism. Under democratic socialism, production for mutual benefit and cooperative relations will replace exploitation and competition. When economic activity is aimed at meeting the needs and wants of the population in an environmentally sustainable manner, instead of for the profit of a small class of property owners, there should be no longer any imperialist drive in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers for these fabulous introductory remarks. Given the time and the number of questions that we have, I'm likely going to group a few together into kind of broader themed questions. So to start off, and this is to all of the panelists, to start off, we know that ending fossil fuels requires what the IPC will often phrase fundamental transformations of all aspects of society. And we're all in this Zoom room today because we think that socialist politics is the only way to achieve that, but then also socialism is kind of what that transformation should seek to constitute in terms of ending fossil fuels and ecological sustainability. But at the same time, that requires us to have particular aspirations in terms of what this new society should look like or the reforms that we're trying to push in the interim. And so I have a two-part question. One is, how do you all think the ecological or decarbonization imperative should shape our aspirations, like what we're fighting for as organizers in the US in terms of producing or allowing for green development, quote unquote green development in the global south. But then also, what do you think are the dangers of institutions such as the IMF, for example, or sort of nexuses of global power taking up climate? I know there are concepts out there like green structural adjustment, carbon shock therapy, there's definitely different ways of framing it, but what do you see as the dangers of climate and decarbonization being pursued through these institutions as is? And feel free to jump in. Sure, David.
Well, the IMF has been talking a good line on greening the economy, but we have a long history of IMF attractive sounding line not being real. The IMF represents interests that are incompatible with the directions that are needed to stave off global climate change. And in our work as socialists, it is of crucial importance to do our part to prevent a block of opposition to greening by powerful groups that try to appeal to working people in the US and the global north, claiming that ecologically sound direction will threaten their livelihoods. And the green the Green New Deal or Green Social Democracy, that direction has to be promoted. Frankly, in my view, we're unfortunately not strong enough to bring socialism quite yet. So I think working for reforms that will both stave off global climate change for a time while improving conditions for working people are the way to go. But realizing that in the long run, capitalism and environmental sustainability are not compatible, and that is a powerful argument for socialism in this period.
I'm going to drop a link in the chat to an essay written by Daniela Gabor, who I mentioned earlier, and it's about what she calls the Wall Street consensus and the kind of surprisingly dominant role that private equity was playing, say, at the COP26 summit. And I think this potentiality that the possibilities of the transition are already being kind of capitalized on by private equity, the international financial institutions, is really a live one. And I think it raises, as Daniela and others have said, real questions about what it would take to actually finance in equitable manner the transition, a global transition, and not only a kind of global north-based transition. So I think in ways I think that stretch beyond my own capacities and are really challenging me, it puts the question of kind of financial and monetary politics really at the center of thinking about transitional justice. And so I would just point to her work as a kind of starting place to think about that question.
It's a huge question, and I feel like we need an additional hour of interventions to address it. But I would just say this: look, I think that we have to be very brutally honest here, which is simply that the call for zero emissions by 2050 is a global average target. It's recognized in the Paris Agreement that the rich countries, which have contributed the overwhelming majority of historical emissions and have colonized the atmosphere for their own enrichment, have a responsibility, ethical and political, to scale down their emissions much faster than that. So we need zero emissions in the US by 2030, 2035. Now, this is possible to achieve, but not under conditions of continued capitalist growth, right? The reason is because simply that drives energy use up, and a rising energy use while you're trying to decarbonize creates very significant problems, which are recognized repeatedly by the IPCC. So what needs to happen instead is that we know that we can meet human needs at a high standard, higher than the US presently enjoys for its working class, which is, by the way, primarily profoundly immiserated for the most part, with much less energy than the US presently uses, right? How do you do that? What you have to do is you have to prioritize production around meeting human needs through universal public provisioning, healthcare, education, decent housing, clean energy, water, public transportation, et cetera, a shorter working week to prevent any unemployment, and therefore effectively take the question of livelihoods and living standards and access to essential goods off the table entirely, right? This has to be a fundamental prerequisite for any radical climate policy if it's going to be just and prevent anyone getting hurt. So we can't allow our leaders to feign a concern for working class populations in the global north and say that they're not taking radical climate action because they're concerned about them. They're not concerned. They never have been concerned. And what will demonstrate concern is organizing again the economy around human needs rather than around capital accumulation. I don't actually see that the speed of decarbonization that is required to meet the Paris Agreement goal of staying under 1.5 degrees is possible with the existing political and economic system in the core economies. And I think that, look, I think we just have to face up to that fact. And the quicker we do, I think the better the position we're in.
Great, thank you. And this is perhaps another two-part question, but there's some interest in the questions that have been posed by the audience and sort of getting at the way that I think most prominently with neoliberalism, but I think it can go back further, the way that the language of development is used to call for some of these structural adjustment and reforms that we've discussed in this panel. So the argument is that if you do X, Y, Z, then your country will develop, and this is what's necessary to have prosperity. And that sits in opposition to our values, but at the same time, it can be difficult to encounter these kind of counter arguments. Well, oh, structural adjustment was good because it delivered some level of growth in the immediate aftermath, or you note that GDP in certain countries, or there's like markers of economic development or progress that have improved since the neoliberal period. How does that, how would we address those sort of counter arguments? And to that effect as well, how do we situate the rise of, you know, global South capitalists? So, you know, there are billionaires from the African continent, for example. You know, how do we make sense of class politics in this sort of global hierarchical sense in that way?
I mean, I guess just to start, I think, you know, there's an important distinction to be made about a politics of that's focused on kind of absolute poverty, right, raising the kind of baseline, and it is, you know, you could say in many ways, in large part owing to the transformation in China, right, the kind of rates of absolute poverty have declined in crucial ways over the last, say, 40 years. But that has coincided, as Jason's, you know, graphs illustrate, with deepening inequality, right? Both deepening inequality in terms of kind of global North and South, but also within post-colonial states. So the kind of entrenchment of a new or an old post-colonial elite has coincided with this kind of declines in absolute levels of poverty. And I think, you know, in some ways, this is why, like, it's important to think about so one thing to say is that moment of the 1970s when the new international economic order was you know, making a demand around equality, right? Not simply raising the baseline of poverty. This is when the World Bank begins to make poverty its primary kind of, one of its primary objects of concern. And this is treated in part in Samuel Moyne's book, Not Equal, or I'll find it, Unequal World, and about human rights and inequality, and I'll put that in the chat. But there is a kind of way of deflecting from a politics centered on equality that kind of brings up and prioritizes this question of sufficiency or raising kind of the baseline. So I think, like, it's important to remember why equality was the primary set of term, the central term, I would argue, around which the politics of decolonization was organized, and why it has to remain kind of at the center of a socialist politics in the present. That's one thing I'll say. The second, about the question of kind of you know, a sort of transnational elite that includes global South actors, is that in many ways, I think one of the lessons, say, of the kinds of critiques that radical anti-colonial nationalists were making in this period was really they understood this kind of overlap between kind of local elites, you know, the comprador bourgeoisie, as Fanon would put it, or some, and others would put it in different ways, and a kind of international economy. So if you read, for instance, Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, it's a book best remembered for, you know, the account of kind of coups and these very, you know, explicit mechanisms of neo-colonial control. But his definition of neo-colonialism centers the ways in which actually post-colonial political elites are much more accountable to external institutions and actors than they are to their own domestic constituencies. So there is already in that kind of account an analysis of the ways in which the structures of ongoing imperialism depend on and require a set of kind of elites within post-colonial societies that are embedded in global economic forces and relations. So I think it's an opportunity to think about to kind of have a complex understanding of the ways in which imperialism works, right? It's not simply a set of impositions from without, right? But it always, historically and in the contemporary moment, depends on co-opting and mobilizing internal structures of hierarchy, internal elites as kind of agents and willing agents of these processes.
You know, Melanie, you raised the question of the language of development, seeming to say there's a choice between following the neoliberal prescriptions of privatization and liberalization and cutting public services, and that's the way you develop, or else if you don't follow them, then there's going to be economic disaster. You know, we don't have to argue about which case is stronger on the face of it. The evidence is overwhelming. If you look at the cases of countries that have really rigorously followed the neoliberal prescriptions in the global south, and also the countries that formerly had Communist Party rule, the ones that most closely followed neoliberal prescriptions have had economic disasters, and the ones that did not have done much better. I mean, I'm familiar with the data on the former Soviet republics, and the World Bank did a study that found whose outcomes showed that the few former Soviet republics that did not disband economic planning completely and that maintained policies that kept up the incomes of working people grew the fastest. So they buried it in an appendix, hoping people wouldn't notice. And of course, it's China that has developed the fastest of any major country in recent times. And they were advised in 1978 to immediately privatize and fully liberalize. And they followed a different path. It's not one that I would have recommended. I didn't think it was so good to give up economic planning, but they did not follow the neoliberal model, but instead maintained significant state regulation aimed at development directly, liberalized only gradually and under control, and they produced the fastest growth of any major country. The evidence is overwhelming, although I think the people in China would have benefited more if they'd followed a socialist direction instead, but that's, you know, I wasn't in a position, I didn't have as much influence as the advisors who were making the decisions.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and it's clear also that neoliberalism actively produced poverty across the global south. And this is such an important point to recognize. And the comparison should not be to what life expectancy was like, in the colonial era. Of course, there's been improvements. Rather, the comparison should be to what could have been achieved under conditions of socialist or otherwise anti-imperialist or otherwise progressive economics. And the evidence is very clear on this. I mean, compare China versus India, for example, for an easy one. But look at Cuba, longer life expectancy than the United States. Look at Costa Rica, which resisted the worst effects of structural adjustment and now has a life expectancy over 80. I mean, this is what the global south could have achieved across the board, completely closing the health gap in its entirety. This would not have taken a lot of effort, and they were already on this path before it was before they were blocked from pursuing it further. So I think this is really the evidence is extremely strong on this. To the question of capitalists in the global south, I mean, yes, there have always been these capitalist class factions. they were successfully repressed effectively from accumulating too much power during the immediate post-colonial decades. With the coups and structural adjustments, they were given additional power. No, the privatization drives handed this capitalist class ridiculous amounts of assets, and now they prevent the possibility of social movements in the global South successfully bringing about more progressive governments in their own countries. And we see this with brutal backlashes against pretty much any social movements that successfully arises. And we see this in the form of the Zapatistas or land defenders in the Amazon or Colombia's workers movement, et cetera, always brutally crushed by precisely the class that was empowered by structural adjustments. And I think that's important to recognize.
Great, thank you all so much. I'm sure we all could have kept posing questions to each of you for hours, but unfortunately, our block for this webinar has come to an end. And so I wanted to tease our next event in this series, which will be on debt. And a number of our panelists throughout have touched upon this issue, but we're hoping to really dig into it in our next session, especially because this subcommittee recently voted to make debt a campaign priority for the next year or so. And we will be launching both organizing activities that participants are welcome to join, and we will be sending out registrations for this next event sometime in the next week or two. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a really great session.